This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. They said the lighthouse had been dark for 15 years, until his dog refused to go below. And what he heard in that basement changed everything he thought he knew about why he'd been sent there. Caleb Marsh hadn't planned on keeping anything. Not the dog, not the duffel bag with its fraying strap, not the silence that followed him from room to room like something with weight. But here he was, standing on the deck of the morning ferry with all three, watching the main coastline dissolve into fog behind him, while something ahead, something he couldn't yet see, waited in the gray. The horn sounded, low, long, shaking through the steel beneath his boots. Storm flinched beside him, ears flat, body tight, then recovered. The German shepherd had heard worse. They both had. Easy. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's back. It's just a horn. But Storm wasn't looking at the ferry. His head had turned forward, toward the island, emerging from the fog like a photograph developing in slow motion. First the tree line, dark spruce ragged against the sky. Then the granite shore, slick and black where the tide had pulled away. And finally, rising above it all, the lighthouse. Harrow Light. A white column stained with weather, its lantern room dark, its catwalk rusted to the color of old blood. It stood at the island's northern point, as if it had grown there, as if the rock had simply decided to reach upward and someone had hollowed it out for keeping. Storm growled, low, barely audible beneath the engine, not at a person, not at a sound, at the island itself, as though the shape of it carried a scent the wind couldn't explain. Caleb looked down. In 6 years, he'd learned to read Storm better than he'd ever read people. The dog's hackles hadn't risen. His stance was wide, weight forward, the posture of assessment rather than alarm. "What is it?" Storm didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the lighthouse, and his tail hung motionless. The ferry bumped against the dock. A deckhand threw lines. Nobody else got off. Caleb shouldered his bag, clicked his tongue once, and walked down the ramp into the cold, salt air of Harrow Island. Storm followed, but slower than usual, stopping twice to look back at the water, as if measuring the distance to the mainland. The dock was old, planks silver with age, bolts rusted into the wood. A single pickup truck sat in the gravel lot above the landing, no one inside. Beyond it, a dirt road curved into the trees. No signs, no welcome committee, just the wind, the gulls, and the distant sound of waves breaking against granite. Caleb inhaled. Salt, pine, diesel from the ferry. Beneath those, something older. Kelp rotting on the shore. Stone holding the memory of 1,000 storms. The air tasted like a place that didn't care whether you stayed or left. He started walking. The keeper's cottage sat 100 yards from the lighthouse, connected by a gravel path that the weather had mostly reclaimed. It was small, a square of weathered clapboard with a pitched roof, 2 windows facing the sea, a door that had once been red. Inside, a kitchen the size of a closet, a main room with a wood stove and a cot, a bathroom where the pipes groaned like wounded animals when he turned the tap. Storm circled the main room twice, sniffed the corners, sneezed once at the dust, then dropped onto the floor near the wood stove and let out a long, dramatic groan. The kind that meant, "This will do, but I want it noted that I'm unimpressed." Noted. Caleb set his bag on the cot, unzipped it. Inside, clothes for a week, a first aid kit he'd packed himself, a flashlight, a folding knife, and at the bottom, wrapped in an old bandana, a photograph he didn't look at. He closed the bag and left it. The cottage smelled of damp wood and absence, the particular emptiness of a place that had been uninhabited long enough to forget what warmth felt like. He opened both windows despite the cold. The sea air flooded in, and for a moment the room felt less like a coffin and more like a choice. He walked outside. Storm stayed. That was odd. Caleb turned back. The dog lay where he'd settled, head up, watching through the open door. Not sleeping, not relaxed, watching. And when Caleb looked toward the lighthouse, he understood. Storm had positioned himself with a clear sight line to Harrow Light, as if the building required monitoring. "Come on." Storm didn't move. "Storm, heel." The dog rose, slowly, deliberately, and followed Caleb out. But he stopped 5 paces from the lighthouse door. Planted, ears forward, nose working the air, body rigid in that way that meant, "I've decided, and I'm not changing my mind." Caleb studied him. In the field, a dog that refuses to advance is a dog that knows something you don't. That was the first thing they'd taught him at Elizabeth City. Not about dogs, about the water. If the current looks wrong, it is wrong. Trust what your body reads before your brain argues. All right. He left Storm where he stood and approached the lighthouse alone. The door was heavy. Oak reinforced with iron bands, a lock that had been replaced more recently than the rest of the hardware. It opened with a key he'd been mailed 2 weeks ago, along with a contract and a phone number he'd never called. Inside, a circular room, stone walls, the smell of lime and age. A spiral staircase climbed toward the lantern room. Below it, a second door, narrower and metal, led downward. Caleb tried the basement door. Unlocked. Ajar, a gap of perhaps 2 inches, darkness showing through like a held breath. He paused, looked back through the open entrance. Storm sat exactly where he'd stopped, silhouette sharp against the gray sky, watching. The wind shifted. Something creaked deep inside the tower. Not the building settling. Something else. Something with a rhythm. Caleb pushed the basement door wider and stared into the dark. He didn't go down that night. Instead, he hauled wood from a shed behind the cottage, built a fire in the stove, heated water for coffee on a camp burner he'd brought. The routine was automatic. Years of Coast Guard discipline compressed into small, efficient movements. Fill the kettle. Set the flame. Wait. Everything in sequence. Everything controlled. Storm lay near the stove, chin on his paws. His eyes followed Caleb's hands the way they always did, tracking motion, reading tension in the fingers, the wrists. When Caleb sat in the single wooden chair and stared at nothing, Storm shifted closer until his shoulder touched Caleb's boot. Spotlight on black water. A hand reaching, fingers closing on a wrist, and then slipping. Caleb blinked, exhaled. The cottage returned. Stone walls, wood smoke, the tick of cooling metal. "I'm here." Storm's ear twitched. One ear, just the left, rotating toward Caleb's voice while the right stayed fixed on the door. Dual tracking, a skill they shared. The coffee was bitter and too hot, and he drank it anyway. Outside, the wind had picked up. He could hear the waves now, not crashing but insistent, a low percussion against granite that never quite stopped. The sound followed him into sleep, or something close to it, and in the gray space between waking and rest, the lighthouse stood above him in his mind, its dark lantern room a socket without an eye. He woke to Storm's breathing, steady, close. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cottage was cold in a way that went beyond temperature. The cold of isolation, of distance, measured not in miles, but in the number of people who knew where you were. 0. That number was 0. Caleb sat up, his right shoulder ground against itself, the rotator cuff torn during a hoist extraction off the Bering Sea, repaired badly, healed worse. He rolled it once, felt the familiar scrape of bone on bone, and stood. Let's go. The lighthouse was different in daylight, less ominous, more sad. A beautiful structure abandoned to weather and bureaucracy. The granite blocks fit together with a precision that modern construction rarely matched. Each one cut and placed by hand 140 years ago. The spiral staircase inside was iron, the steps worn smooth by generations of keepers climbing to tend a light that no one needed anymore. Caleb climbed. At the top, the lantern room opened to a 360 view of the Atlantic. Gray-green water stretching to a horizon that looked like the edge of something. The glass panels were cracked in 2 places, letting in wind that smelled of open ocean. He stood there, gripped the railing. His hands tightened before he told them to. 18 years he'd spent on that water. SAR swimmer, aviation survival technician, the official name for the people crazy enough to jump out of helicopters into storm seas to pull strangers back from drowning. He'd been good at it, better than good. The kind of good that gets quiet nods from senior chiefs and a folder of commendation letters that mean nothing once you're standing in a VA waiting room with a number and a clipboard. I used to belong out there. He said it to no one, to the water, to the 18 years that lived in his shoulders and his nightmares, and the scar on his left forearm where a hoist cable had cut to the bone on the worst night of his life. Below, Storm barked once, short, clipped, not alarm, just, "I'm here, don't forget." Caleb looked down. The dog sat in the same spot, 5 paces from the door, watching the sky. "Yeah, I know." He descended. That night, the basement called him back. It started with a sound, a low hum beneath the wind, barely perceptible, a frequency you felt in your teeth more than heard. Caleb sat up on the cot. The fire had died again. Storm was already awake, already standing, his body aimed at the cottage door like a compass needle finding north. "Stay!" He grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the night. The air hit him. Raw, salted October cold that found every gap in his jacket. The lighthouse stood against the stars, its white column catching just enough moonlight to glow faintly, like bone. Inside, the hum was louder. Caleb descended the spiral staircase to the basement door, still ajar, still dark. He clicked on the flashlight and went down. Concrete steps, 12 of them, each one slick with condensation. The beam of light swept across the space below. A rectangular room, maybe 20 by 15 feet, stone walls weeping moisture. Old radio equipment lined one wall. Vacuum tube receivers. A telegraph key, green with verdigris. Dials and meters from an era when lighthouses were communication stations as well as navigation aids. All dead, all dark. Except one. A single unit, smaller than the others, sat on the far end of the bench. Its casing was different, newer, though someone had scratched it deliberately to make it look weathered. The faceplate showed no brand, no serial number visible from this angle, but behind the mesh of its speaker grill, a tiny LED pulsed green. Slow, steady, alive. Caleb stepped closer. The hum was coming from here. A carrier signal, the kind a radio throws when it's receiving but not transmitting. Static leaked from the speaker in thin, rhythmic bursts. He reached for the unit, then stopped. His hand hovered. The training kicked in before the thought did. Don't touch what you don't understand. Assess the environment first, then act. He swept the flashlight beneath the bench. Cables ran from the radio unit down to the floor, along the baseboard, and disappeared through a hole drilled in the stone wall. Fresh hole, clean edges. Someone had punched through 140-year-old granite with a masonry bit, recently enough that the dust hadn't been cleaned away. He followed the cables to the wall and crouched. Behind a rusted filing cabinet, pushed against the wall to hide exactly this, sat a generator. Compact, military style. A rig you'd find powering a field command post. Fuel line running to a small external tank. It was warm to the touch. Running. Right now. Powering the radio. In a lighthouse that had been disconnected from the grid for 15 years. Caleb stood. He looked at the radio, at the generator, at the cables snaking through a hole that hadn't existed when this building was last officially occupied. Someone was using this lighthouse. Someone who had power and equipment and a reason to hide both. He clicked off the flashlight, stood in the dark for 10 seconds, an old habit, letting his eyes adjust, letting his other senses take inventory. The hum continued. The static pulsed. And somewhere above him, through stone and iron and 100 feet of salt air, he heard storm. One bark, then silence. Caleb climbed the stairs. At the top, he found what he expected. Storm pressed low, ears pinned, body blocking the entrance to the basement stairwell. Not growling, not barking again, just positioned. Guarding. Yeah, I found it. Storm's eyes caught the flashlight beam. Steady. Knowing. Somebody's running a signal station out of our basement. Storm didn't move. Caleb stepped over him carefully, and the dog fell into stride behind him, close enough that his shoulder brushed Caleb's calf with every step. Outside, the night was enormous. Stars over the ocean, the mainland a suggestion of light on the western horizon, and between here and there, nothing but black water and the sound of it meeting stone. Caleb looked back at the lighthouse, at the dark lantern room, at the basement door he'd left exactly as he'd found it. Someone had drilled through granite to run cables to a hidden radio. Someone was powering it with a generator that shouldn't exist. And someone had given Caleb Marsh a key to the front door, a paycheck, and a reason to be the only person for miles. He needed to know who, and why, and what the signal was saying to whoever was listening at the other end. But first, he needed to know something else, something that had been nagging him since the ferry. The basement door had been ajar when he arrived, unlocked, open, as if someone had left in a hurry, or as if someone wanted him to find exactly what he'd found. Morning arrived late on Harrow Island. The sun had to climb above the mainland ridge before it cleared the tree line. Even then, the light came filtered through sea haze, thin, provisional. Caleb woke with his hand on Storm's neck, which meant the nightmares had come again, and the dog had done what the dog always did, placed himself within reach and waited. He didn't remember the dream. He never did. Just the residue. Racing pulse, damp shirt, the phantom grip of fingers closing on nothing. He fed Storm first. Kibble in a stainless bowl, fresh water from the tap that tasted of rust and distance. The dog ate methodically, head down, jaw working, no rush. A creature with no questions about where he belonged. "We need supplies." Storm looked up, kibble dust on his muzzle. "And a vet, apparently. You look like you fought a bag of flour." The walk to town took 20 minutes. A gravel road winding through spruce and birch, the ocean appearing in flashes between the trees. The town, if you could call it that, was a cluster of buildings around a natural harbor, a general store that also served as the post office, a church the size of a garage, a fuel dock, and a small white building with a hand-painted sign that read Harrow Island Medical Clinic, Dr. C. Winslow. The general store was warm and smelled of coffee and floor wax. A woman behind the counter, 60 maybe, with a face that had decided long ago how much friendliness it would offer strangers, nodded once. "Mornin'. You the Lighthouse man?" Caleb Marsh. "Helen Rigby. I run the store. You need anything? This is it." Understood. He bought coffee, canned goods, batteries, a second flashlight. Storm waited outside, sitting on the porch with the patience of a dog who understood that human errands were a necessary bore. When Caleb came out, Storm wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing at the edge of the porch, tail level, watching something down the road. Caleb followed his gaze. The clinic. Its door was open, and a woman in a blue fleece was carrying a box inside. Storm descended the porch steps and walked, not toward Caleb, not toward the truck, toward the clinic. Deliberate, purposeful. His nose was working, but his body language wasn't alert. It was something else. Interest. Decision. "Storm." The dog didn't stop. Caleb followed. He didn't have a choice. When Storm decided something, argument was decorative. The dog reached the clinic porch, climbed the 2 steps, and sat directly in front of the open door, looking inside with the quiet authority of someone arriving for an appointment. The woman appeared. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed onto her forehead. She stopped when she saw the dog. "Well," she crouched slowly. "Hello." Storm tilted his head, a slow, measured tilt that in 6 years Caleb had learned to translate. "You're interesting. I'll allow this." The woman held out her hand, not reaching, offering. Storm sniffed it once. Then he stepped forward and placed his chin on her knee. Caleb stood at the bottom of the steps, watching something happen that he hadn't expected and couldn't explain. Storm didn't do this. Storm tolerated strangers at best, ignored them usually, and occasionally placed himself between Caleb and anyone who moved too fast. He did not, ever, offer himself to someone he'd just met. The woman scratched behind Storm's ear, the dog's eyes half closed, and his tail, that barometer, swept once across the porch. He doesn't usually do that. She looked up. Her eyes were brown, direct, the kind that assessed before they welcomed. "I'm Claire Winslow. I'm the doctor, the only one, so the title's less impressive than it sounds. Caleb Marsh. I'm watching the Lighthouse." "I know." She stood, brushing dog hair from her pants. "You're the 4th one." "4th?" "Caretaker. In 3 years." She paused, and something moved behind her expression. Not pity, not warning. Something closer to exhaustion. "How long are you staying?" "Until they tell me to leave." Claire looked at him for a long moment, then at Storm, who remained on the porch with his chin still extended toward her, as if the answer to Caleb's question mattered less than whatever the dog had already decided. "They all say that." She turned to go inside, then stopped, looked back over her shoulder. "Your dog has a sea urchin spine in his left front paw. Bring him in. I'll pull it." Caleb looked down. Storm lifted the paw in question, barely, just enough to confirm, and then set it down again with the dignity of someone who'd been caught limping and intended to deny it. Inside the clinic, Claire worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in a place where this could mean anything from stitching a fisherman's hand to diagnosing pneumonia over the phone. The spine came out clean. Storm endured it without protest, his head turned toward Claire, watching her hands with an attention that bordered on trust. While she worked, Caleb said nothing. He looked at the shelves, organized, sparse, an inventory that reflected careful rationing rather than abundance. Medications, bandages, splints, everything a small island clinic might need, and nothing extra. "Dr. Winslow." "Claire?" "Claire." He hesitated, and the hesitation itself surprised him, because Caleb Marsh had spent 2 decades making decisions in seconds, and here he was, choosing words like someone walking through a room full of glass. "Has anyone mentioned anything unusual about the Lighthouse?" Her hands paused on Storm's paw, just for a moment. Then she resumed, wrapping a small bandage. "Unusual how?" "Sounds, equipment, activity that doesn't match a building that's been closed for 15 years. Claire tied off the bandage. She didn't look up. No one talks about the lighthouse. Not to me. She stood, washed her hands at the small sink. But I'll tell you something. We've been losing medications. Small amounts. Oxycodone, hydrocodone, gabapentin, controlled substances. I thought it was inventory error. I filed 3 reports with the mainland pharmacy. And? Nothing. Every time. Their eyes met. The silence held a shape between them. Not empty. Not comfortable, but structured. Like the frame of a question neither of them was ready to ask aloud. Storm looked at Claire, then at Caleb, then back at Claire. He yawned once, an enormous, deliberate yawn that broke the tension so completely it was almost strategic, and laid his head on Claire's shoe. Claire looked down, the smallest crack in her composure. Not a smile, but the place where a smile might begin. "He can stay," she said, "as long as he wants." She meant the dog, but Caleb heard something else beneath it, something that sounded like the first honest thing anyone on this island had said to him. The boat came in the afternoon. Caleb heard it before he saw it. A diesel engine, heavy, a sound that carries across water with the authority of something that expects to be noticed. He was on the path back to the lighthouse, Storm walking ahead with the slightly offended gait of a dog wearing a bandage he considered unnecessary. When the engine sound cut through the trees, he stopped, listened, assessed. The sound came from the eastern side of the island, not the main harbor, not the ferry dock, somewhere else. By the time he reached the lighthouse clearing, a boat was already tied at the small stone quay below the bluff. A working vessel, 40 feet, rust along the waterline. And a man was walking up the path toward the cottage. Storm went still. Not a growl, not a bark, just stillness. The kind that in the field meant contact, direction unknown, hold for assessment. His left ear rotated toward the approaching figure, while his right stayed fixed on the boat. Dual tracking again. The man was maybe 55, weathered in the way island people get, skin like leather left in the sun, hands that had hauled rope and gutted fish and never bothered with lotion afterward. He wore work boots, canvas jacket, a cap pulled low. He walked with the easy confidence of someone who'd made this trip many times. "Help you?" The man stopped, looked at Caleb, looked at Storm. Something moved behind his eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or recognition. Ray Pelletier. He extended a hand that Caleb shook once and released. "I checked the properties for Mr. Whitmore, the State Preservation Office. Caleb Marsh. I'm the caretaker." "I know." Ray's smile was practiced, friendly enough to pass, thin enough to mean nothing. "Just wanted to see how you're settling in. Make sure the cottage is habitable. The last fellow left in August. Said the damp got to him." Caleb nodded slowly. He watched Ray's eyes, and Ray's eyes went past him, past the cottage, straight to the lighthouse, lingered there for exactly 2 seconds. "Mind if I check the tower? Whitmore likes a report." "Go ahead." Ray walked to the lighthouse, opened the door with his own key. Caleb noted that, and went inside. Caleb counted the seconds. Storm counted something else, his nose working the air where Ray had stood, sampling, cataloging. 4 minutes. Ray was down there 4 minutes before he came back up, closing the door behind him with a casualness that was slightly too careful. All good. Ray crossed the clearing, hands in his pockets. Island gets rough in winter, you know. Most caretakers don't last past November. I'm from the coast. Which one? All of them. Ray studied him for a beat, then that practiced smile again. Well, good luck, Chief. He touched his cap, a gesture that could have been friendly, could have been dismissive, and walked back toward the key. Chief. Caleb hadn't mentioned his rank, hadn't mentioned the Coast Guard, hadn't mentioned anything except his name. Storm's left ear twitched. Once. Caleb waited until the boat engine faded. Then he walked to the lighthouse, opened the door, and descended to the basement. The radio unit sat where it had been, the LED still pulsed green. But the frequency display, which Caleb had memorized the night before, had changed. Someone had been down here, someone with a key, and they'd changed the channel. He pulled the folding knife from his pocket and scratched 2 small marks into the concrete floor beside the radio bench. Position markers, alignment notches, fieldcraft they'd taught him not in rescue swimmer school, but in the quiet conversations afterward, when the senior chiefs talked about what to do when the world stopped making sense, and all you had was observation and time. Then he climbed the stairs, closed the basement door to exactly the gap he'd found it, and walked back to the cottage. Storm sat in the doorway, watching. Not the lighthouse this time. The water. The direction Ray Pelletier's boat had gone. Yeah. Caleb crouched beside him, one hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady rhythm of breathing. That was the only certainty left. I noticed too. The pattern revealed itself over the next 3 nights. Caleb didn't sleep. Not really. He dozed in intervals, the way he'd learned on deployments, 40-minute cycles with his boots on and his ears open. Each night at the same hour, 2:17 a.m., precise enough to set a watch by, the radio in the basement came alive. He didn't go down. Not yet. He listened from above, ear against the stone floor of the lighthouse entry, Storm lying flat beside him. The signal was brief, a burst of encoded data lasting 12 to 15 seconds. Then silence. 3 consecutive nights, then nothing for 4. A cycle. A schedule. On the morning after the 3rd signal, Caleb sat at the cottage table with a mug of cold coffee and a tide chart he'd borrowed from Helen Rigby's store. Storm lay at his feet, not sleeping, monitoring, the way he always did when Caleb went quiet and his hands stopped moving. The timing wasn't random. At 2:17 a.m., 3 nights running, the tide at the eastern shore of Harrow Island reached its highest point. Deep enough for a boat with moderate draft to navigate the rocks that guarded the coves. During the 4 dark nights, the tide cycle shifted. The window closed. Caleb traced the coastline on a navigational chart. Also borrowed. Also unreturned. The eastern shore had 3 coves, but only one was deep enough during high tide to allow actual access. Widow's Cove, a C-shaped inlet shielded from the main harbor sightline by a granite headland. He calculated distance. 12 nautical miles to the nearest Canadian port. A fast boat could make the crossing in 90 minutes, leaving Canada after dark, arriving at the cove during the high tide window, offloading and returning before dawn. The lighthouse signal would serve as both confirmation and navigation marker. A green light in a dark tower, visible only from the east, telling the incoming vessel the window is open. Come now. SAR training had given Caleb many things, most of them painful, but it had also given him this: the ability to read water, read timing, read the invisible architecture of currents and tides that governed everything that moved on the ocean's surface. And right now, that architecture was telling him a story. Someone was running a schedule. 3 nights on, 4 off. A tide-dependent delivery route. A radio signal from a lighthouse that was supposed to be dark. He picked up the coffee. Cold. He drank it anyway. Training flashback. Elizabeth City. The instructor standing knee-deep in the pool, stopwatch in hand. Radio is your lifeline, Marsh. Lose it, you're dead. Understand it, and you control who lives and who doesn't. The memory faded. The cottage returned, storms breathing, the tick of wind against the windows. Okay. He set the mug down. Let's go for a walk. Storm's ears perked, the first sign of uncomplicated happiness in days. They walked to Widow's Cove. It took 40 minutes through dense spruce, the path non-existent except to someone who knew how to read terrain, which Caleb did. The cove opened below them from a granite ledge, a crescent of dark water cupped by rock, invisible from the harbor, invisible from the ferry route, invisible from everything except the lighthouse. Caleb descended carefully. The rocks were slick with tide residue and something else. Scrape marks. Deep gouges in the granite where something heavy had been dragged recently. He crouched, ran his fingers along the marks. Then he looked at the waterline. Rope burns on a natural stone bollard. Fresh. Someone had tied off here, and recently, within the week. He walked the cove's perimeter. Storm ranged ahead, nose to the ground, following scent trails that Caleb couldn't detect. Near the waterline, wedged between 2 rocks where the tide had deposited it, Caleb found a piece of clear plastic. Pharmaceutical packaging, the kind used for blister packs. He picked it up, turned it over. A label fragment. Partial text, water-damaged, but legible. Codone, 10 milligrams, / distributed by, / RX only. Hydrocodone. Prescription. The same class of controlled substances Claire had reported missing. Caleb stood. He looked at the cove, at the lighthouse above, at the water between here and Canada. Not street drugs, not organized crime. Prescription medications, diverted from legitimate supply chains, smuggled across an international border by water, received at a cove accessible only during specific tide windows, signaled by a radio hidden in a building the state had abandoned, but someone had very quietly repurposed. Storm appeared beside him, a length of wet rope in his mouth, frayed, salt-stiffened, recently cut. He dropped it at Caleb's feet with the air of someone presenting evidence. Good boy. He pocketed the label fragment and the rope. Then he climbed back to the ridge, Storm at his side, and looked at the lighthouse one more time. 15 years dark. That's what they'd told him. But the radio had power. The cove had traffic. And somewhere between a state preservation office and a Canadian pharmacy, someone had built a pipeline that used a historic landmark as its beating heart. Caleb turned toward the cottage. He had a phone. Satellite, unreliable but functional. He had a contact at Sector Northern New England who owed him a favor from a SAR case 4 years ago. He had evidence in his pocket and a pattern in his head. But he also had a feeling, the one he'd learned to trust more than evidence, more than patterns, more than the rational architecture of investigation. A feeling that said, they know you're here. They chose you. And whatever happens next, it won't be on your schedule. Storm walked ahead, tail level, still carrying something invisible in his bearing, an alertness that hadn't faded since the ferry. Yeah, Caleb said. Me too. Claire's clinic smelled of antiseptic and careful order. Every bottle aligned on its shelf, every instrument in its drawer. The kind of precision that came from someone who'd learned the hard way what happened when things weren't where they should be. Caleb recognized it. He kept his own spaces the same way, not from neatness, but from the understanding that chaos was always one unlocked drawer away. He set the label fragment on her desk. The plastic was salt-stiffened, edges curled, but the text remained legible under the fluorescent light. Claire picked it up with the tips of her fingers, turned it over, and her face changed. Where did you find this? Widow's Cove, Eastern Shore, wedged in the rocks at the waterline. Claire set the fragment down. She pulled a ledger from beneath the counter, thick, handwritten, pages tabbed with colored flags, her pharmacy records. She opened it to a page near the back and traced a column with her fingernail. Hydrocodone, 10 milligrams. She looked up. I ordered 60 units in September. 42 arrived. I filed a discrepancy report. The mainland pharmacy said the shipment was complete. How long has this been happening? Claire closed the ledger slowly, both hands flat on the cover. 8 months, maybe longer. I only started tracking it in February because a patient needed gabapentin and I didn't have enough. I thought it was inventory error, a shipping mistake. She paused. I kept thinking someone would call me back. Nobody called. Nobody called. The silence between them held a different texture now. In the clinic's small examination room, with its single window looking out at the harbor, and a German shepherd lying on the floor between their chairs, something shifted from suspicion into alliance. Claire hadn't asked Caleb why he was investigating. She hadn't questioned his authority or his motives. She'd opened the ledger. That meant something. The radio in the lighthouse basement, Caleb said. It's running on a hidden generator. Someone installed new equipment behind the old panels and wired it to transmit on a 3-night cycle that matches the high tide windows at Widow's Cove. Claire's hands didn't move from the ledger. Her eyes narrowed, and he watched the connection form behind them. The doctor's mind assembling symptoms into a diagnosis. Prescription drugs coming by water through the cove. She looked at the label fragment again. These aren't street drugs. This is diversion. Someone's pulling medications from legitimate supply chains before they reach me. And using the lighthouse as the signal point. Storm lifted his head from the floor. He looked at Claire, then at Caleb, then yawned enormously, jaws stretching wide enough to display every tooth, and settled back down with a groan that vibrated through the floorboards. The tension cracked. Claire almost smiled. "Your dog has excellent timing." "He thinks so." "There's a fisherman," Caleb said. "Hank Brewer. He goes out at odd hours, different from the other boats." Claire shook her head. "Hank's been fishing these waters for 30 years. He runs illegal lobster pots on the north side. Everyone knows. Nobody reports it because he shares the catch with the widows on Pine Street." She paused. "He's harmless." Red herring number 1, gone. Caleb filed it away. The blood in the lighthouse basement. On the floor near the radio bench. Old. Dried. Claire's expression cleared. "Tom Millard, the caretaker before the one before you. Cut his hand open on a burst pipe down there. I stitched him at 2 in the morning because he was too proud to come to the clinic during business hours." She gave a small shrug. "Island men." Red herring number 2, also gone. Which left only one thread: the radio, the cove, the schedule, and the man who'd given Caleb the key. They sat for a moment without speaking. Storm lay between them on the clinic floor, his chin resting on Caleb's boot, and Claire's hand rested on the ledger, and the room held the particular stillness of two people who had just agreed, without saying so, to step into something dangerous together. "I need to see your ordering system," Caleb said. "The full chain. From when you place a prescription order to when it arrives on the island." "It goes through a mainland distributor, Portland Pharmaceutical. They ship to the ferry terminal, and the ferry brings it over with the mail and general cargo. My orders are flagged as controlled substance, so they're supposed to be signed for at every handoff." Supposed to. She opened the ledger again and showed him a page. "I sign here when I receive. But look, these dates, the shipments that came up short, the ferry manifest shows the full quantity loaded in Portland. The shortage happens somewhere between the dock and my clinic." "The ferry dock here or the mainland?" "Here, on the island, between the harbor and my door." Which meant someone on the island was pulling packages off the ferry cargo before Claire could receive them. Someone with access to the dock. Someone who knew which boxes contained controlled substances. "Who handles the cargo?" "Two people. Helen Rigby sorts the mail and general deliveries. And Ray Pelletier. Ray handles anything labeled as preservation office property. He has a standing arrangement with the ferry captain. Official supplies bypass the general sort and go straight to his truck." There it was. The supply chain had a hole, and Ray Pelletier was standing in it. That night, the signal changed. Caleb lay on his cot at 2:14 a.m., boots on, jacket zipped, counting breaths in the dark. Storm lay flat on the floor beside him, chin on his paws, ears rotating like satellite dishes, scanning for contact. At 2:17, the hum started below. Same time, same pulse. But tonight, it lasted longer. 20 seconds. 30. Then a burst that was different from the pattern he'd cataloged over 3 nights. Denser, carrying more data. He was downstairs before the signal ended. The radio's display showed new numbers, a longer string than before. He'd memorized the format from a week of observation, and this wasn't a confirmation ping. This was coordinates. and a timestamp. Caleb pulled a pencil from his back pocket and scratched the numbers on the concrete floor beside the generator. Then he translated them in his head, converting degrees and minutes into a position on the water as naturally as reading a sentence. 18 years of SAR operations had made nautical coordinates a second language, one he read faster than English when it mattered. Widow's Cove, 72 hours from now. The delivery was scheduled, but there was more. Beneath the coordinates, the signal carried a second data burst he hadn't seen before, shorter, compressed. He couldn't decode it here, not without equipment he didn't have. But the structure was familiar. A handshake protocol, a signal response pattern used to confirm receipt. Someone was supposed to answer. He swept the flashlight across the bench. The old equipment sat undisturbed, green with age. But the newer unit, the one with the green LED, had something he'd missed on previous visits. A second faceplate, hidden behind the first, screwed in with hex bolts that were clean and bright against the weathered casing. Fresh metal, recent work. Caleb unfolded his knife and used the flat of the blade to turn the first bolt. Then the second. The faceplate came away. Behind it, a serial number stamped into steel, and a date. Manufactured September 2024. 14 months ago. This wasn't salvage. This wasn't repurposed equipment from some government surplus auction. This had been built, purchased, and installed with intent. The lighthouse hadn't been co-opted by opportunists. It had been selected, equipped, and turned into a station. And someone had given him the front door key. His phone buzzed in his jacket. One bar of signal, flickering. A number he recognized from the contract paperwork. Caleb answered. Mr. Marsh? The voice was warm, unhurried, with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. Gerald Whitmore. I hope I'm not calling too late. 2:17 in the morning, the same minute the signal had fired. Not at all. Just checking in. I like to make sure our caretakers feel welcome. It's a lonely post, I know. A pause, filled with something that might have been concern, or might have been calculation wearing concern's face. I hope you're finding the lighthouse interesting. Old radio equipment, mostly rust. Nothing works. Good. That's good. Another pause. Longer. The sound of a man choosing his next words with the care of someone placing stones on a scale. Some caretakers get curious, you know. Start poking around in the basement, the old storage rooms. It never ends well for them. The words landed in the dark basement like stones dropped into still water. Caleb stood among the cables and the hidden generator and the freshly manufactured radio with its 72-hour countdown, and he held the phone to his ear and he said nothing. Because the silence was more useful than speech. It told Whitmore that Caleb had heard the warning, and it told Caleb that Whitmore already knew exactly where he was standing. I appreciate the call, of course. Margaret would have loved that lighthouse, my wife. She always said the most important light comes from the darkest places. A breath. She passed 3 years ago. Cancer. I suppose that's why I care so much about keeping these buildings alive. They outlast us. They should. I'm sorry about your wife. Thank you, Mr. Marsh. Good night. The line went dead. Caleb lowered the phone. The green LED pulsed. The generator hummed, and the numbers he'd scratched into the concrete floor glowed faintly in the flashlight's beam. A countdown to something he now understood he'd been placed here to ignore. But that line about Margaret, the grief in Whitmore's voice had been real. A river dammed and redirected toward a purpose the water never chose. The man wasn't a monster. He was something more complicated and therefore more dangerous. A man who'd found a way to make his pain profitable and called it preservation. Spotlight on water. A face. A hand. 30 seconds. He'd counted. He always counted. 30 seconds between the moment her fingers slipped and the moment the spotlight lost her in the dark. Storm was at the top of the stairs, pressed low against the stone, ears back, watching Caleb climb toward him with the patience of something that understood waiting as a form of loyalty. When Caleb reached the top, Storm leaned into his side, shoulder against hip, and didn't move. He knows. Storm's breathing slowed, matched Caleb's. Sink. He chose me. He thought I'd drink and disappear. 3 caretakers before me, and they all left. I'm not leaving. The lighthouse stood around them, dark and hollow, and for the first time since arriving, Caleb understood its architecture as something other than a building. It was a trap, with the door still open and the bait sitting in the basement, humming. And the man who'd set it was a widower who missed his wife and had traded his principles for the only currency grief understands: enough. Caleb sat on the cold stone floor of Harrowlight, his dog beside him, and he made a choice the same way he'd made every choice that mattered in his life. Not with words, not with plans, but with the simple act of not standing up and walking away. The next 2 days moved like surveillance. Caleb let the island show him its routines, and in the gaps between them, he built his case. Claire had a laptop at the clinic, connected to the island's single satellite internet link. Slow enough that loading a web page felt like an act of faith. Together, they searched. Not for evidence of smuggling, not yet, but for the man who designed the architecture. Gerald Whitmore. State Historic Preservation Officer, Maine. 31 years in the department. Responsible for the maintenance and protection of 47 historic structures across the coast. 12 of them lighthouses. A career built on quiet advocacy, small budgets, and the belief that buildings deserved saving even when the people who'd built them had been forgotten. He's not a criminal, Claire said, scrolling through a 10-year-old feature article in the Portland Press Herald. The headline read, "Guardian of the Coast, One Man's Fight to Save Maine's Lighthouses." A photograph showed Whitmore standing on a rocky promontory, smiling, younger, with a woman beside him whose face carried the particular brightness of someone who didn't yet know what was coming. Margaret. People change. People break. She kept scrolling. There's a difference. Margaret Whitmore. Claire had found the obituary. 3 years old. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed 2019. Treated at Maine Medical Center. Died January 2023. She paused, reading further. 3 rounds of chemo. 2 surgeries. An experimental treatment in Boston that insurance denied. She looked up. The bills would have been catastrophic. How catastrophic? I can tell you what ovarian cancer treatment costs in this state, because I've referred patients to the same oncologists. She closed her eyes briefly. 400,000. Minimum. And that's before the experimental protocol. That would have doubled it. Caleb leaned back. Storm lay beneath the desk, chin resting on Caleb's boot, eyes half closed, listening to everything, judging none of it. The dog's breathing was steady, metronomic, an anchor Caleb reached for without thinking. So he's underwater by 500,000 or more. He controls 12 empty lighthouses along the coast, buildings that nobody visits, nobody monitors, each one sitting on a piece of shoreline with water access and a signal tower that used to broadcast, but doesn't anymore. He looked at Claire. He didn't just find an opportunity. He built infrastructure. For what exactly? Prescription drug diversion. Canadian supply, American demand. The drugs move by water at night, stage at locations nobody's watching, then disperse into the mainland distribution network. He paused, working the logic aloud. Your missing medications aren't the main operation. They're spillage, the overflow. What falls off the edge? Because the pipeline runs through your supply chain on its way to something much bigger. Claire closed the laptop slowly. In the silence, the clinic's old refrigerator hummed, and Storm shifted beneath the desk, readjusting his chin on Caleb's boot with the fussiness of a creature who took comfort positions seriously. Gerald visited the island last month. Personally. He never does that. When exactly? September 14th. He came on the morning ferry, spent 3 hours, left on the afternoon run. She met Caleb's eyes. He stopped by the clinic, asked about my prescription ordering schedule. What I ordered, how often, from whom. I thought he was conducting some kind of audit for the state, being thorough. He was being thorough, just not about preservation. He was mapping the supply chain, identifying gaps, determining how much could disappear without triggering an investigation. Claire said what Caleb was thinking. He was sizing me up, figuring out how much he could steal before I noticed. And when you did notice, he counted on nobody listening. Nobody did. Until you. Storm's tail moved once against the floor. Not wagging. Punctuation. Caleb stood. Storm rose with him, stretching once, front legs extended, spine curved, a full body reset. Then fell into heel position with the automatic precision of an animal who'd spent years matching his stride to someone else's. I need to see the cove again, with fresh eyes. On the way out, he passed the island's small chapel. White clapboard, unlocked door, a steeple barely taller than the spruce trees behind it. He slowed, looked at the door. Something about it, the simplicity maybe, or the fact that it asked nothing, made his feet want to stop. But his mind was already at the cove, already calculating currents and approach vectors, and the chapel would have to wait for a day when thinking wasn't a tactical exercise. Storm glanced back once, as if noting the hesitation, and then faced forward again. Widow's Cove looked different in late afternoon light. The shadows fell from the west, stretching across the water, and the granite walls of the inlet held the cold in pockets that made the air feel 10 degrees colder than the surrounding forest. Caleb descended the bluff path carefully, his right shoulder protesting every handhold with the grinding complaint it had carried since the Bering Sea extraction. And Storm picked his way behind him with the cautious attention of a dog who'd learned that rocks near water required a different category of respect. At the waterline, he found what he was looking for. More scrape marks on the stone bollard, fresher than last week's. New rope burns laid over old ones in crossing patterns that told a story of repeated use. And near the high water mark, half buried in gravel, a length of medical-grade tubing, the kind used for IV lines. Clean. Recent. Someone had been careless, or confident enough not to care. Caleb photographed everything with his phone: the bollard, the rope marks, the tubing, the waterline. Then he crouched and studied the cove itself, reading it the way he'd read 1,000 bodies of water during his career. Not as scenery, as information. Current analysis was second nature. The cove's sea shape created a predictable flow pattern. Incoming tide pushed water clockwise along the granite walls. Outgoing pulled counter. The rocks that guarded the entrance were submerged at high tide, but exposed at mid-cycle, forming a natural gate. A boat entering at the right window could ride the current in, and a pilot who knew the cove's underwater contour could navigate the passage using the lighthouse as a fixed bearing. From the cove floor, Harrow Light's lantern room was visible above the headland at precisely 22 degrees off the northern horizon. A green LED in a dark tower, visible only from this angle, invisible from everywhere else. Elegant. Professional. Someone had spent real time designing this approach, not a fisherman's trick, an operation. He traced the high water mark along the cove's perimeter, looking for more detritus, more evidence of loading and unloading. Near the eastern wall, where the rock formed a natural shelf at waist height, he found wear patterns consistent with heavy boxes being set down and picked up repeatedly. The granite was polished smooth in a rectangle roughly 18 inches by 12. The size of a pharmaceutical shipping container. Storm's ears snapped forward. His whole body stiffened, weight shifting to his rear legs, nose aimed at the tree line above the bluff. The shift was instant. A state change Caleb had learned to treat as gospel. When Storm went from relaxed to rigid in under a second, something had entered the dog's perceptual field, and whatever it wasn't wind, and it wasn't wildlife. Caleb froze. Read the dog. Storm wasn't growling, wasn't barking, holding, which meant whatever he'd detected was present, stationary, and observing. Caleb didn't look up. He continued studying the waterline, hands busy, body deliberately relaxed. But every sense he had was pointed at the trees above them, and the training that never left was calculating angles and distances and the number of seconds between where he crouched and the nearest cover. A branch cracked. Faint. 20 meters upslope, maybe 30. The sound of weight on dead wood, not a squirrel or a raccoon. Something heavier. something that knew how to move through trees, but not well enough to avoid every dry branch on the forest floor. Storm shifted, placing himself between Caleb and the sound. Not a command response. Instinct. The dog's body became a wall, 80 pounds of muscle and intent, and behind that wall, Caleb straightened slowly and turned. Nothing visible, just spruce and shadow, and the wind moving through branches, with a sound like pages turning in an empty room. They climbed back to the ridge path. Caleb walked without hurrying, without looking behind him, letting his footsteps carry the message that he wasn't afraid and wasn't retreating. Storm walked slightly ahead, ears swiveling, sampling the air in rapid inhales that cataloged scent the way a camera captures frames. At the cottage, the door was closed. Caleb had left it closed, but the latch sat at a different angle, canted 3 degrees to the right. A detail most people would miss. But a man who'd spent 18 years checking equipment and hatches and door seals before every operation registered small changes automatically, without effort, because small changes killed people. He opened the door. Inside, everything in its place. Nothing taken, nothing broken, but his notebook, the one he'd been using to log radio frequencies and tidal patterns, sat on the table at a different angle. The pencil beside it had been moved. Not far, just enough. Someone had read his notes, and they'd left them there for him to know it. The message was clear. We see you. We know what you know, and we're still deciding what to do about it. Storm entered the cottage, circled once, a perimeter check compressed into 4 seconds, and lay down across the threshold of the front door with his head facing outward. Not sleeping, guarding. His body filled the doorframe, and his eyes scanned the clearing with the flat, professional attention of a creature who'd just been promoted to a position he intended to hold indefinitely. Yeah. Caleb sat at the table and looked at the notebook, at the pencil, at the careful, deliberate violation of his space. That's about right. He picked up the pencil and wrote 1 word at the bottom of the page, beneath all the frequencies and coordinates and tide calculations. Whitmore. Then he circled it, twice. The evening came early, as evenings do in northern Maine in October. Darkness falling at 4:30 like a curtain someone let go of too soon. Caleb built a fire, fed Storm, ate canned soup standing at the kitchen counter because sitting still made his mind run, and running made the memories sharper. Claire came at 6. She knocked twice, a rhythm Caleb had already cataloged without meaning to, filed under known, safe, allowed. Storm recognized the knock before Caleb did, his tail moving once against the floor. Not wagging, acknowledging. A single sweep that said, approved, and nothing more. She brought coffee, real coffee, ground in a paper bag from a roaster on the mainland that she ordered monthly as the one luxury she permitted herself. And her clinic records, 3 months of prescription orders, printed on the clinic's ancient inkjet, in fading black, that made each page look like a document already becoming history. They spread the records on the table. Storm relocated from the threshold to the floor between their chairs, equidistant, maintaining coverage of both the door and the humans, a tactical position disguised as laziness. The pattern's consistent, Claire said, tracing columns with her fingernail. Every shipment that crosses water to reach the island loses between 8 and 15% of controlled substances. The losses started 9 months ago, within weeks of the first caretaker arriving. Before that, my records match the orders perfectly. 9 months ago, what changed? The caretaker position was reactivated. She looked at him across the table, across the scattered records, across the dog who lay between them like a treaty. Whitmore reopened the lighthouse for seasonal maintenance, said the preservation office had secured new funding. The first caretaker arrived in January and left when? March. Told people the isolation was too much. The second one lasted until June. The third made it to August. They all left voluntarily? That's the official version. The fire cracked. A log shifted, sending sparks against the screen. Storm's ears twitched at the sound, but his body didn't move, and Caleb watched the play of firelight across the walls, and thought about 3 men who'd come to this island and left again, each one carrying a story that probably wasn't the one they told. Claire. He set down his mug. Tomorrow you need to take the ferry. Go to the mainland. Take copies of these records to the Coast Guard sector office in Rockland. Ask for the duty officer and tell them you're reporting suspected narcotics diversion on a federal waterway. Use those words exactly. Federal waterway. It triggers a different response protocol. And you? I stay. That's the plan? You stay on the island, alone, with the people who broke into your house? They didn't break in. They opened a door. He paused. There's a difference. The difference being? A break-in is panic. An open door is a message. Messages mean they're still deciding. He looked at Storm, then back at her. As long as they're deciding, they're not acting. You learned that in the Coast Guard? I learned that in water. A riptide doesn't grab you all at once. It tests you. Pulls a little, lets go, pulls again. It's deciding whether you're worth the effort. The moment you feel it commit, that's when you swim parallel, not against. He paused. We're still in the testing phase. Claire studied him across the table. The firelight caught the lines at the corners of her eyes, lines that spoke of long hours and hard winters, and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd chosen to practice medicine in a place where the nearest hospital was a ferry ride and a prayer away. And Caleb was aware, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be aware of someone in a very long time, that she was beautiful. Not simple, not easy. Beautiful in the manner of complicated things, like a coastline that changes with every tide and never looks the same way twice. She stood, gathered the records. At the door, she stopped. Walk with me? The cliff was 10 steps beyond the cottage. Beyond it, the ocean stretched into darkness, visible only as sound, the deep, rhythmic breathing of water meeting stone, and the faint, phosphorescent curl of waves that caught starlight and held it for a moment before letting go. They stood on the cliff's edge, side by side, not touching. The wind was cold. Storm lay behind them, positioned where he could see both the ocean and the cottage and the path, covering every approach with the calm efficiency of someone who'd accepted that vigilance was his vocation and saw no reason to complain about the hours. Claire's hand rested on the granite railing, a natural outcrop that some previous keeper had smoothed flat for exactly this purpose, for exactly this view. Caleb's hand rested beside it. The gap between their fingers measured in inches, and those inches held everything neither of them had said. The fear, the wanting, the understanding that starting something on an island where you couldn't leave was either brave or stupid or both. I'm not good at this. Neither am I. The ocean moved below them, vast and indifferent, and full of things that had been lost to it. Caleb looked at the water. For the first time in weeks, looking at the water didn't make his chest tighten. He noticed that suddenly, with a strange mix of relief and distrust. Storm shifted behind them, letting out a long exhale through his nose. The sound a dog makes when the people he's watching finally stop needing to be watched quite so hard. I'll take the morning ferry, Claire said. I'll be back by evening. Take copies. Keep the originals somewhere safe. My clinic safe. Combination lock. Old-fashioned. She looked at him. I'll give you the combination. In case... She didn't finish. She didn't need to. You'll be back. I know. But just in case, she told him. He memorized it instantly, permanently, filed in the part of his mind where critical information lived alongside breathing and balance and the instinct to reach for someone who was drowning. She turned to go, then turned back. Caleb? Yeah? Be here when I get back. It wasn't a request. It was the closest thing to vulnerability she'd shown him in 10 days, and he understood its cost because he knew what it cost him to show the same thing. I'll be here. Claire left. Her footsteps faded down the gravel path, swallowed by the dark, and then there was only the wind and the waves and Storm's breathing and the night. Storm stood, walked to Caleb, and leaned his full weight against Caleb's leg. Not his shoulder, not his side, his full 80 pounds, committed, as if the dog had decided that the man needed a wall and had volunteered to be one. Caleb rested his hand on Storm's head. Yeah, me too. Morning came wrong. Caleb woke to silence. Not the island's usual silence, which had texture and rhythm and the small sounds of life inside it, but a flatness, a dead channel, the sound equivalent of a wall painted white to hide whatever was behind it. He reached for his phone. No signal. Not weak signal. Not one flickering bar. 0. The tiny antenna icon showed an X where reception used to live, and nothing he did, restarting, repositioning, walking to the window, changed it. Storm. The dog was already at the window. His body told the story before Caleb's eyes confirmed it. Ears flat, spine rigid, tail dropped and still. The posture of an animal who'd heard something in the night that the morning hadn't explained. Caleb crossed to the window. The clearing looked normal. His truck sat by the path. The lighthouse rose against a gray sky. But something was off, and it took him 4 seconds to identify it. The ferry schedule. Thursdays. The first boat arrived at 7:15. It was Thursday. It was 8:40. No horn had sounded, no engine had rumbled across the water. The harbor was quiet, in a way that harbors shouldn't be at the start of a working day. He turned on the VHF radio he kept on the kitchen shelf, an old Marine band unit, battery-powered, the kind of backup equipment Coast Guard personnel hoarded, like other people hoard flashlights. Static. Not the signal kind, with its peaks and valleys and information hidden in the noise. The empty kind. White noise. The sound of nothing where something should be. All right. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his jacket, and walked to the harbor. The route took 12 minutes. Storm walked ahead, checking each turn of the path before allowing Caleb to follow. A protocol they'd developed without ever discussing it, the way two people who've worked together long enough develop a language that doesn't require words. The harbor was quiet. 3 fishing boats rocked at their moorings, lines creaking against cleats. Helen Rigby stood outside the general store, arms crossed, watching the empty water where the ferry should have been. "Morning, Helen." "Ferry's cancelled. Weather advisory." She pointed at the sky, which was gray but calm. Wind at maybe 10 knots. Seas at 2 feet, if that. "That's not weather." "That's what the notice said." Her tone carried the particular resignation of someone who'd lived on an island long enough to know that not all cancellations were about weather, and not all questions were about getting answers. Caleb walked to the stone quay where he'd moored his boat, a 12-foot aluminum skiff he'd bought from a fisherman the previous week. Cash, no paperwork. The kind of transaction that left no trail because both parties preferred it that way. The skiff was gone. The mooring line dangled from the cleat, cut clean. Not frayed, not untied. Cut. A blade had gone through 3/8-inch nylon in a single stroke. He crouched, touched the cut end. The fibers were slightly warm from the friction. Recent. Within the last 2 hours. While he'd been sleeping. Stranded. No phone. No ferry. No boat. One road, one harbor, one way off an island that someone had just sealed shut. He walked to Claire's clinic. She stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself against the morning cold, and he knew before she spoke that the news had reached her too. "Ray Pelletier came by the store this morning," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "He told me I should focus on my patients." He said, "Exactly. Doctor, you should focus on your patients. The harbor is not your concern." Exact words? Exact words. He wasn't threatening. He was... She searched for the right term. Informing. That's the same thing, just quieter. Storm stood between them, his head turning from one to the other as they spoke. Not anxious, attentive, reading the space between their words the way he read the space between footsteps, measuring tension by its temperature rather than its volume. "Claire, the records, are they safe?" "Clinic safe, where I told you." "Good." He looked at the sky, at the water, at the empty horizon where the ferry should have been. "We need another way to get word to the mainland." "There is no other way. Not from here. Not without a boat." "There's always a way, It just costs more. He spent the afternoon in the lighthouse, not the basement, the lantern room. From the top, on a clear day, the mainland was visible, a dark line against the western sky, maybe 12 nautical miles. Close enough to see, too far to swim. And between here and there, nothing but the North Atlantic in October, which was its own kind of wall. The radio signal fired again at 1:43 p.m., outside the normal schedule. Caleb heard the hum from the lantern room, felt it in the structure's bones. A new burst, compressed, urgent. He didn't go down to decode it. He didn't need to. The rhythm told him everything. The schedule had accelerated. The testing phase was over. At 4 o'clock, he fed Storm. The dog ate slowly, his eyes lifting to Caleb between bites, reading the tension in the room through the air, through the invisible language that passed between them without words. When the bowl was empty, Storm didn't go to the door for his usual evening walk. He stayed, sat beside Caleb's chair, waited. I know. At 4:30, Storm went outside, not to the path, not to the clearing, just outside the door, into the small yard between the cottage and the tree line where the light was fading and the spruce were turning from green to black. Caleb heard it before he understood it. A single yelp, short, sharp, cut off. He was through the door before the sound finished echoing. His body moved before his mind caught up. The old training, the rescue swimmer's imperative that said, someone's hurt, and didn't wait for additional information before responding. Storm stood 20 yards from the cottage, near the tree line where the path turned toward the lighthouse. He was standing, which was good. He was looking at Caleb, which was good. But his left shoulder carried a dark patch that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago, and when Caleb reached him and crouched, his fingers came away red. No, the word came out before thought, before training, before any of the careful, measured responses that 18 years of crisis work had built into his nervous system. Just the word, raw, cracked at the edges. A rock lay in the grass beside the path, fist-sized, blood on one edge. Someone had thrown it from the trees and hit Storm in the shoulder. Not a bullet, not a knife. A rock. The oldest weapon. The most contemptuous. The kind of violence that said, I could have done worse, and next time I will. Caleb's hands were shaking. He parted Storm's fur carefully, the way he'd parted clothing on wounded swimmers in helicopters and on pitching decks and in the water itself, looking for the wound beneath the symptom, the truth beneath the blood. His fingers trembled through the first pass, not from cold, not from weakness, but from something deeper. Recognition. His hands had been here before, in the dark, in the water, reaching for someone who needed him to be steady. The wound was shallow, a 2-inch gash across the deltoid muscle, bleeding freely but not deeply. No embedded fragments, no bone involvement. A wound that would heal in a week, scar in a month, and not matter at all in any medical sense. It mattered in every other sense. He carried Storm inside, not because the dog couldn't walk. Storm was already putting weight on all 4 legs, but because Caleb needed to carry him, needed the weight in his arms, needed to feel the warmth and the heartbeat and the living proof that the world hadn't taken one more thing. He laid Storm on the cot. heated water on the camp burner, found the first aid kit. He cleaned the wound. Warm water first, rinsing the blood from the fur, watching the water turn pink as it ran between his fingers and into the basin below. The iodine came next, amber on cotton, and Storm held still for it, not flinching, not pulling away, just watching Caleb's face with those brown eyes that had never once in 6 years looked away when Caleb needed them not to. His hands steadied on the second pass. By the third, the training had taken hold. The mechanical precision of a man who dressed wounds on surfaces that wouldn't stop moving, whose fingers had never failed him when someone else depended on their steadiness. But his hands had failed him once. "Easy, boy." His voice cracked. He didn't try to fix it. Easy. As he pressed the gauze flat against the cleaned wound, his thumb brushed something beneath the fur. A ridge. Old. An old scar, healed long before Caleb had found Storm in that county shelter, sitting in the corner of a concrete run, facing the wall, refusing to look at anyone who passed. Someone else's damage. Someone else's cruelty. A history written in tissue that Storm carried without complaint and without explanation. The way veterans carry shrapnel that doesn't show on X-rays. Caleb sat back on his heels. He looked at Storm's old scar. Then he looked at his own left forearm, the long white line where the hoist cable had cut to the bone on the night everything ended. 2 scars. 2 creatures who'd been cut open by a world that didn't always explain why, and who had chosen, despite evidence and experience and every rational argument for giving up, to stay in it. Storm shifted on the cot, not away from the wound, toward Caleb. He pressed his uninjured shoulder against Caleb's ribs and held there, steady, warm, present. The language they spoke, the one that needed no words and accepted no substitutes. The flashback came after, not during, after, when the wound was dressed and the water was cooling in the basin and the first aid kit was closed and there was nothing left for his hands to do. The images arrived through a door he'd forgotten to lock. The helicopter's rotors beating the air into a sound that wasn't a sound. It was a pressure, a weight on the skull. The spotlight cutting through rain and spray, turning the ocean surface into a flickering white map of chaos. The woman in the water, 30 feet below, her life jacket keeping her face above the waves, but nothing keeping the fear off it. The hoist cable screaming against the drum as he descended. Contact. His hand on her wrist, her hand on his. The grip tight. Mutual. 2 strangers holding on to each other because the alternative was the dark. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 seconds. Not 30. He'd told himself 30 for years, because 30 sounded like enough time to have tried, enough time to be blameless. But it was 5. 5 seconds between contact and loss, between holding and gone, between the last moment her eyes met his through the spray, wide, terrified, understanding, and the moment the wave lifted between them like a wall, and her fingers slid through his grip 1 millimeter at a time, and then the spotlight swept across empty water where a person had been. Storm's shoulder pressed harder against his ribs. Real. Warm. Here. Caleb blinked. The cottage returned, the fire nearly out, the medical supplies on the table, the dog on the cot, bandaged and steady and alive. I'm here. Storm's ear twitched. One ear. Just the left. I'm here. He sat on the floor beside the cot, his back against the wall, and Storm's breathing slowed to match his own. Outside the cottage, the island settled into the kind of darkness that exists only in places where the nearest streetlight is 12 miles of open water away. And somewhere in that darkness, the people who had thrown a rock at his dog were waiting to see what he would do. At 9:14 p.m., the radio in the lighthouse basement fired a signal he hadn't heard before. Longer, more complex, with the urgent cadence of a machine carrying news that couldn't wait. He didn't need to go down to decode it. The timing told him everything. The accelerated burst from the afternoon, the stranding, the cut phone signal, the rock. They knew he knew, and they were moving the delivery up. Not 72 hours from the original signal. Tonight. Caleb looked at Storm. The dog looked back, bandaged, steady brown eyes catching the last of the firelight. Unbroken. All right. He stood, checked the first aid kit, checked the flashlight, checked the flare gun he'd found in the lighthouse's emergency supply closet 3 days ago, and loaded with the only 2 cartridges that weren't expired. They made a mistake. Storm's ears came forward, alert, ready, as if the bandage on his shoulder were a decoration and not a wound. They hurt you. Now I'm paying attention. Caleb sat at the table with the flare gun, 2 cartridges, a flashlight, and a map of the island he'd drawn himself over 10 days of walking every path and shoreline Harrow had to offer. Storm lay beside the chair, bandaged shoulder facing up, his breathing steady. Outside, the dark had settled into the kind of permanence that October brings to northern islands. Not just absence of light, but presence of something else. Something that filled the spaces between trees and buildings and people with a weight you could almost lean against. Assess. Plan. Execute. The words surfaced from 18 years of training. Slowly, inevitably, carrying sediment from every mission and every failure. He picked up the pencil. The radio in the basement was still transmitting. The delivery was coming tonight. Pelletier and whoever crewed the incoming boat would arrive at Widow's Cove during the high tide window, which his calculations placed between 1:40 and 3:10 a.m. 90 minutes. That was the operational frame. He had no phone, no boat, no backup on the island. Claire was here, but Claire was a doctor, not a combatant, and he would not, could not, put her in a position where the skills that mattered were the ones she didn't have. What he did have: knowledge of the cove's underwater terrain, knowledge of radio protocol, a flare gun with 2 shots, and the radio itself. The smuggler's own equipment, still powered, still transmitting, still connected to whatever network Whitmore had built along the coast. So Storm's ear rotated toward his voice. Just the left. The right stayed on the door. Standard Coast Guard distress protocol. Channel 16, 156.8 megahertz. If I transmit a mayday on the smuggler's radio using proper format, Sector Northern New England will pick it up. Every station within range will pick it up. It's federal law. You hear a mayday, you respond. He spoke to Storm. He always spoke to Storm when he was planning, because the dog didn't interrupt, didn't second guess, and didn't pretend to understand things he didn't. Storm listened completely, without judgment, holding everything offered and returning only what was needed. But timing matters. I transmit too early. The incoming boat hears the chatter and diverts. Too late, they've already offloaded and gone. I need them in the cove, committed, past the rocks, where the current traps them if they try to run. Then I broadcast. He drew a line on his map. The cove entrance, the submerged rocks, the current patterns at high tide. His pencil traced the path a boat would take, the same path he'd calculated from reading the water at Widow's Cove, from measuring the scrape marks on the bollard, from counting the seconds between wave sets against the entrance rocks. SAR swimmers learn to read water the way musicians read scores. Not individual notes, but relationships between them. Patterns that repeated, and patterns that broke. And the breaking was where the truth lived. The cutter out of Rockland can make Harrow in 40 minutes, maybe 35 if they push it. So I need to hold the cove for 35 minutes between transmission and arrival. Storm's tail moved once. Not excitement, acknowledgement. Yeah, that's the hard part. He sat back, looked at the flare gun. 2 shots, one to signal Claire. She'd agreed to watch from the harbor, and if she saw a red flare from the eastern headland, she'd know the plan was in motion. The second shot was reserve. You always kept a reserve. That was SAR doctrine, the kind of principle you carried in your bones after enough missions where the first plan failed and the second plan saved your life. He looked at Storm. The dog's bandage was clean, properly wrapped, the wound beneath it already beginning the slow work of repair. Caleb had checked it an hour ago. The swelling was down, no infection. A week, maybe less, and the shoulder would carry weight again without complaint. But the rock that had caused it was still sitting in the grass outside the cottage, and the people who'd thrown it were still somewhere on this island. And the next thing they threw might not be stone. You're staying here tonight. Storm's ears adjusted, both forward. The posture of a dog who has heard a command and is deciding how seriously to take it. I mean it. Stay. Storm held his gaze. Then he lowered his head to his paws. Not submission, agreement. The difference was in the eyes, which remained open, alert, tracking Caleb's hands as they moved across the map, filing away every gesture in whatever archive dogs keep for the things their people do when they think no one is watching. Claire arrived at 9. She'd crossed the island in the dark, which told Caleb something about her courage that her words never would. Storm acknowledged her with a nose bump against her hand, brief, businesslike, the canine equivalent of a security clearance. Here's what I need you to do. He laid out the plan. Claire listened without interrupting, her arms crossed, her weight on one leg, the stance of a woman who'd spent years receiving bad news, standing up, because sitting down made it harder to act. When he finished, she looked at the map, at the flare gun, at the man across the table who was asking her to trust him with something that had no safety net and no second chance. What happens if they get to you before the cutter arrives? I know the rocks. They don't. The cove is my terrain. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. There's another option. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded paper. Hank Brewer, the lobster man. I talked to him tonight. He's not part of this, I'm certain. And he's angry. His granddaughter was prescribed gabapentin for seizures, and the last 2 refills came up short. She unfolded the paper. A phone number. A boat. A man with a reason. He'll run to Rockland tonight. 3 hours there, drop the records at Sector, 3 hours back. By dawn, they'll have everything. Caleb stared at the paper. At the number. At the plan that was better than his, because it didn't require him to hold a cove alone against armed men for 35 minutes with a flare gun and a wounded dog. You did this. I've been on this island for 3 years, Caleb. I know who to trust. Hank left an hour ago. He's already on the water. The room shifted. The tactical calculus changed. Hank Brewer on the water meant the evidence was moving toward authority through a channel Whitmore couldn't intercept. It meant that, regardless of what happened at the cove tonight, the records would reach Sector. The machine would start. But it also meant tonight still mattered, because the delivery was coming. And if the boat arrived and offloaded and disappeared before the Coast Guard responded, the evidence would show a pattern, but not a crime in progress. The difference between an investigation and a prosecution, between suspicion and certainty. I still need them in the cove. I know. The SOS stays. I transmit when they're committed past the rocks. Hank's evidence gets the investigation started. The Mayday gets them caught. Claire nodded. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand on his. Not holding, not squeezing, just resting there, palm against knuckles, and the warmth of it traveled up his arm and settled somewhere behind his sternum, where warmth hadn't lived in a long time. Come back from the cove. Plan to. She left the flare gun on the table, took the second cartridge. I'll be at the harbor. When I see your flare, I'll fire mine. The fishing boats will see it. Everyone will come. Storm watched her go. When the door closed, he turned to Caleb and let out a single, soft bark. Not alarm. Commentary. Yeah, I know. Caleb stood, checked the first aid kit one more time, checked the flashlight batteries. Then he walked outside. The chapel was 40 yards from the cottage, set back from the main path in a clearing that someone had kept mowed even after the congregation had shrunk to a handful. White clapboard, unlocked door, a steeple that barely cleared the spruce canopy. He'd walked past it twice without stopping, once without even slowing. But tonight, his feet carried him to the door, and his hand found the iron latch, and he opened it. Inside, the chapel was the size of a large room. 8 pews, 4 on each side. A simple wooden cross on the far wall. No stained glass, no ornamentation, just clean lines and the smell of old wood and candle wax. Moonlight came through the plain windows and lay on the floor in silver rectangles. Storm had followed. Of course he had. The dog padded down the center aisle, sniffed the nearest pew, and lay down beneath it with a soft exhale, as if churches were a category of building he'd assessed and approved. Caleb sat in the last pew. He didn't pray. He didn't know how anymore, or whether he ever had. What he did was sit and breathe, and let the silence fill the spaces that the planning and the fear and the anger had hollowed out over the past 12 hours. 30 seconds. No, 5. 5 seconds. That was the truth he'd told himself tonight in the cottage, with Storm bleeding on the cot. Not 30. 5. And in those 5 seconds, he had held on with everything he had. And it hadn't been enough. And she had died. And the water had closed over the place where she'd been, like a sentence ending without punctuation. He sat in the dark chapel for 2 minutes, maybe 3. He didn't count. For once, he didn't count. He let the time pass unmeasured, and the silence held him without asking him to explain why he was there. And when he stood, something had shifted. Not healed, not resolved, shifted. The way a bone shifts back toward alignment before the body does the long work of knitting it together. Storm rose from beneath the pew, stretched, and walked to the door, waiting. All right. They walked back to the cottage. Caleb collected the transmitter, the battery pack, the flare gun. He loaded the cartridge. He pulled on the waterproof jacket that he'd packed in his duffel 10 days ago because a Coast Guard man always packs a waterproof jacket, even when he's running from the water. Stay. Storm lay down by the wood stove, chin on paws, eyes open. Caleb walked into the dark. The cove at midnight was a different country. The tide had begun its climb, black water rising against granite in slow, patient surges that sounded like breathing. The rocks at the entrance were already half submerged, their dark shapes visible only as disruptions in the moonlight reflected on the water's surface. Above the headland, Harrow Light stood against the stars, dark as it had been for 15 years. Except for the faint green pulse in its basement that only someone at sea, approaching from the east, would ever see. Caleb crouched behind a granite outcrop on the cove's northern wall, 30 feet above the waterline. From here, he could see the entire inlet, the entrance, the natural dock where the scrape marks told their story, and the open water beyond. The radio transmitter sat beside him, wired to a battery pack he'd disconnected from the basement generator and carried up the bluff in his pack. Heavy. Necessary. Storm was not beside him. He'd left the dog at the cottage. The first time in 6 years he'd deliberately separated from Storm for an operation. The word stay had cost him more than he'd expected. Not because Storm resisted, but because the dog had obeyed instantly, dropping to his belly by the wood stove with his chin on his paws and his eyes tracking Caleb to the door with an expression that contained no confusion and no complaint. Only the absolute trust of a creature who believed that his person would come back. That trust was the heaviest thing Caleb carried tonight. Heavier than the radio. Heavier than the flare gun. 1:20 a.m. The water continued to rise. Wind from the northeast, steady at 8 knots. Visibility, moderate. Moonlight through broken cloud cover, enough to see shapes on the water, but not enough to read faces. Caleb's breathing had fallen into the old rhythm without him noticing. In, hold, out. The cadence of a man who'd spent hundreds of hours in the dark, waiting for something to happen, knowing that when it did, The waiting would feel like it had lasted forever, and the action would feel like it lasted no time at all. 137. Engine sound. Low, distant, coming from the northeast, the direction of the Canadian border. Caleb's body went still. Not tense, calibrated. Every sense aligned on a single bearing, locked onto the sound. The sound grew. Not one engine, two. Two vessels running without lights, their wakes invisible against the dark water. He tracked them by sound alone. Diesel, medium displacement, fishing vessels that could carry 2,000 pounds of cargo and still make 12 knots in moderate seas. The first boat entered the cove at 1:44 a.m., riding the incoming tide through the submerged rock channel. Its pilot knew the route. No hesitation, no course corrections, just a clean line through the gap that told Caleb this wasn't a first run. This was practiced. This was routine. The second boat followed 3 minutes later. Wider swing on the approach, more cautious. A less experienced pilot, or a bigger vessel. Or both. From the stone dock below, a flashlight blinked twice. Pelletier. Already there, already waiting, having crossed the island from wherever he kept his own boat moored. 2 blinks meant clear to approach. Caleb had watched him use the same signal 4 nights ago from the Lighthouse lantern room. The first boat cut its engine and drifted to the dock. Lines were thrown, voices, low and professional, the clipped exchanges of people who'd done this enough times that communication had been compressed to its minimum. Cargo began moving. Boxes, Caleb counted by sound. The thud of composite containers on stone, the scrape of weight being shifted, the zip of straps being loosened. 8 boxes, 10, 12. The second boat reached the dock. More lines, more voices, more cargo. Now, Caleb lifted the transmitter. His fingers found the frequency dial. 156.8 megahertz. Channel 16. International distress. The frequency every Coast Guard station, every commercial vessel, every fishing boat within 100 miles monitored 24 hours a day. He pressed the transmit key. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Harrow Island Lighthouse. Harrow Island Lighthouse. Harrow Island Lighthouse. Position 44 degrees, 17 minutes north, 068 degrees, 49 minutes west. Observing multiple vessels engaged in suspected narcotics offloading at Widow's Cove, Eastern Shore. 2 vessels, no running lights. Request immediate Coast Guard response. This is Harrow Island Lighthouse. Over. He released the key. Static. 3 seconds. Then the radio erupted. Below him, every head turned. Pelletier's flashlight swung upward, scanning the bluff. Voices shifted from professional calm to sharp urgency. Someone shouted in French. Quebecois French. Fast, angry. An engine roared to life. The second boat, the one with the cautious pilot, tried to reverse out of the cove. Its propeller churned white water, but the tide was against it now, pushing into the inlet, and the submerged rocks at the entrance were a maze in the dark for anyone without precise knowledge of the channel. The hull scraped granite. The engine screamed. The boat lurched sideways, caught between current and stone. Caleb fired the flare. It rose from the headland, a red star climbing against the black sky, slow and bright, painting the cove and the boats and the men on the dock in crimson light. For a moment, everything was frozen in that red glow. Pelletier's upturned face, the boxes stacked on stone, the first boat pulling away from the dock, the second boat grinding against the rocks at the entrance. Then the red faded, and the dark rushed back in. From the harbor, a mile to the west, a second flare rose. Claire. Pelletier moved fast. He abandoned the cargo on the dock, ran for the bluff path, and climbed with the urgency of a man who understood exactly how small the window was between now and the arrival of people with authority. 2 other men followed him, the crew from the first boat, which had pulled away from the dock and was now attempting to navigate the entrance channel at speed. Caleb didn't run. He descended from his position on the northern wall, moving along the granite ledge toward the waterline with the controlled steps of someone who'd spent his career on surfaces that wanted to kill him. Wet decks, icy rails, storm-battered helicopter skids. His feet found purchase where others would have slipped, and his hands read the rock through pressure, through texture, through a language that spoke only to people who'd bothered to learn. Pelletier reached the cove floor first. He saw Caleb in the dark, a shape moving along the rocks, silhouetted briefly against the reflective water, and stopped. "You stupid son of a bitch!"
"Evening, Ray."
The 2 men were 15 feet apart. Pelletier had something in his right hand. Metal, glinting in the faint moonlight. Not a gun. A boat knife, the kind every fisherman carried. 6 inches of stainless steel, designed for cutting line and, occasionally, for convincing people that certain conversations were over. "Coast Guard's coming, Ray. Sector picked up the Mayday. 40 minutes, maybe less." "You don't know what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done." Caleb kept his voice level, calm in crisis. The training held even when the pulse didn't. "Widmore's operation is finished. The records are already on their way to Rockland. The boat behind you is stuck on the rocks. And in about 30 minutes, this cove is going to be the best lit place on the Maine coast." Pelletier's breathing was ragged, not from exertion, from the particular panic of a man watching his exit close. He stepped forward. The knife caught moonlight. From the cove entrance, a sound. Not an engine, not a voice. A crack. Loud. Structural. The second boat, wedged against the rocks, its hull splitting under the combined pressure of tide and stone. Water pouring in. And then a shout. Not anger. Fear. Someone in the water. Both men turned. The boat was going down. Its stern had lifted as the bow caught on a submerged ledge, and the cold black water of Penobscot Bay was flooding through a hull breach that grew wider with every wave. 2 men were in the water. Their shouts echoed off the cove walls, sharp, animal, the universal sound of people who understood that the ocean was not a thing that negotiated. Pelletier looked at the water, looked at Caleb, looked at the knife in his hand. Then he dropped it. Not a decision about right or wrong, a decision about priority. He ran for the dock, looking for rope, for a line, for anything that could reach the men in the water before the cold took them. Caleb looked at the water. The water, black, cold, moving with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. The same water that had taken a woman from his hands 6 years ago. The same temperature, the same darkness, the same complete indifference to human intention. His chest tightened, not gradually, all at once, as if someone had reached inside his ribs and closed a fist around his lungs. His hands began to shake, and the shaking traveled up his arms and into his shoulders and settled at the base of his skull, where the oldest part of his brain lived, the part that remembered every drowning he'd witnessed and every hand he'd held, and every face that had disappeared beneath the surface while he counted the seconds, because counting was all he had left. The flashback didn't come as images this time. It came as sensation, cold fingers slipping through his grip, the exact weight of a human hand when the person attached to it has stopped fighting, the spray that tasted of salt and failure and 30 seconds. 5 seconds. 5. It was 5 of holding on before the ocean decided it was done waiting. He couldn't move. His feet were granite. His lungs refused full breath. The water was right there, 12 feet below the ledge, black and alive and waiting, and his body, trained for exactly this, refused. The men in the water shouted again, weaker. The cold was taking their voices first, then their strength, then everything else. Caleb knew the sequence. He'd studied it. He'd lived it. He knew how many minutes they had, and the number was not large. From the cottage, half a mile away, through the spruce trees and the darkness and the cold October air, a sound. Barking. Distant. Persistent. Rhythmic. Storm. Not alarm barking, the frantic, scattered sound of a dog in distress. This was steady, measured. One bark every 2 seconds. A cadence, a count. A rhythm that matched exactly the breathing pattern Caleb had learned in a pool at Elizabeth City 15 years ago, when an instructor stood waist deep in the water and said, "The ocean doesn't care if you're afraid. Breathe. In. Hold. Out. That's all you control. Everything else is water." Storm was barking in time. Caleb closed his eyes. The barking continued. Steady, patient. The sound of a dog who'd been told to stay and had obeyed every part of that command except the part that conflicted with a higher directive, one that lived deeper than training, deeper than obedience, in the place where loyalty stopped being a word and became a frequency, a rhythm. A lifeline made of sound sent across half a mile of dark forest, because that was all he could send, and it was everything. In, Caleb breathed. Hold. He held. Out. He opened his eyes. The water was still there. The fear was still there. The memory of a woman's fingers sliding through his grip was still there, and it would always be there. And he understood now, standing on the edge of a granite ledge above black water, with 2 men drowning and a dog barking and a Coast Guard cutter 30 minutes away, that the fear was not something to defeat. It was something to carry. The way he carried the scar on his arm. The way Storm carried the scar on his shoulder. Not healed, not gone. Carried. He jumped. The cold was total. Every nerve fired at once. A white-hot cold that erased thought and replaced it with the body's absolute refusal to accept what the will had already decided. His muscles locked. His vision whited out. For 3 seconds he was nowhere. Not in the cove, not in the past, not anywhere a mind could name. Just cold. Just water. Just the cellular scream of an organism that had been designed for land and had chosen, again and again, to enter the sea anyway. Then training took over. Muscle memory is deeper than thought. It lives in the fibers and the synapses and the places where repetition has carved channels so deep that consciousness becomes optional. His arms began to move. His legs kicked. His head broke the surface, and he gasped, a ragged, involuntary sound that was half breath and half something closer to a cry of recognition. Because the water was familiar. The cold was familiar. The darkness pressing against his face was familiar. And the knowledge of what to do next rose from the same place the fear had risen, and it was stronger. The current pushed him clockwise along the cove wall. He used it. Let it carry him toward the sinking boat, reading the water through his body instead of his eyes. The thrashing man was 15 feet ahead, fighting the cold, fighting the weight of his waterlogged clothes, fighting the ocean with the desperation of someone who didn't understand that fighting was the fastest path to losing. Caleb reached him, wrapped an arm across his chest from behind. The cross-chest carry. Basic rescue swimming. The first thing they teach you, and the last thing you forget. The man fought him. They always fought. Fear is not a thing that understands help. Stop. One word. The command voice. The one that came from a place below rank and above request. The voice that said, I am the thing between you and the water. And if you fight me, we both go down. Stop moving. I've got you. The man stopped. Not because he understood, because the voice left no room for alternatives. Caleb towed him to the stone dock. The current helped. 20 strokes, maybe 25, kicking hard, the cold working on his legs now, numbing them from the feet up. Pelletier was at the dock's edge. Ray Pelletier, who 10 minutes ago had held a knife, and who now reached down with both hands and hauled the gasping man onto the granite. No words between them, no thanks. Just the raw, graceless mechanics of survival, performed by 2 men who had nothing in common except the understanding that a person drowning takes precedence over everything else. Caleb turned back for the second man. The hull had shifted. The boat was nearly vertical now, its bow pointing at the sky, and the man who'd been clinging to it had lost his grip. He floated 10 feet away, face up, not thrashing, not calling out. Still. The stillness that comes not from calm, but from cold. Hypothermia's first gift. The body stops fighting, and the mind follows. Caleb swam. 8 strokes, 6. His right shoulder screamed with every pull, the rotator cuff grinding against itself. The old injury and the new cold conspiring to turn his arm into something less useful than it needed to be. He reached the man, grabbed the collar of his jacket, pulled. Dead weight. 180 pounds of human becoming cargo, losing the war with temperature 1 degree at a time. He kicked for the dock. One arm locked around the man's chest, the other pulling water. And the cold worked on his own body now with the quiet efficiency of a thing that kills by subtraction. Warmth. Then feeling. Then coordination. Then consciousness. You could feel each one leaving, stacked like dominoes. And between each falling domino was a stroke, a kick, a breath, a choice to keep moving. The dock. Pelletier's hands again. Together, they pulled the second man up. Caleb felt for a pulse. Found one. Slow, but present. He rolled the man onto his side, recovery position, airway clear. And then he collapsed. Not standing, not sitting. Collapsed. Flat on his back on the cold granite dock, chest heaving, arms spread, the sky above him full of stars, and the water below him full of everything he'd been afraid of for 6 years. He lay there. 5 seconds. The same number. But these 5 seconds held something different from the 5 that haunted him. These 5 seconds held the sound of 2 men breathing who hadn't been breathing a minute ago. The cold was still in him. The fear was still in him. But something else was in him too. Something that sat beside the fear and didn't try to remove it. Something that said, "You went in. That's all. You went in." And then sound. Close. Real. The scrabble of claws on granite. A warm, wet nose against his cheek. Weight settling beside him. 80 pounds of wounded, bandaged, disobedient dog who had crossed half a mile of dark island to reach a cove he'd never been to, because his person was in the water, and staying wasn't an option. Storm licked his face. Once, twice. Not frantic, thorough. A systematic check, conducted with the professionalism of a creature who took vital signs through his tongue. "I told you to stay." Storm didn't respond to that. He lay down beside Caleb on the dock, pressed his uninjured shoulder against Caleb's ribs, and breathed. Steady. Warm. Present. The warmth spread from the point of contact outward, slow and certain. And Caleb let it come. Let it replace the cold, 1 degree at a time. And his hand found Storm's neck and rested there, feeling the heartbeat, strong and even. And he let it replace his own, until the 2 rhythms merged and the shaking stopped, and the water was just water again. From the west, over the headland, a sound that Caleb Marsh knew better than his own name. The deep, twin diesel rumble of a Coast Guard cutter. Running lights appeared, cutting through the dark. White over red, the navigation signature of a vessel on an emergency heading. Storm. The dog lifted his head. They're here. Storm's tail moved once against the stone. A single sweep. Acknowledged. The cutter rounded the headland. Its spotlight blazed to life, a column of white that swept across the cove, illuminating the sinking boat, the cargo on the dock, the men on the stone. and at the center of it all, a man and a dog lying side by side on the granite. Wet, cold, together. Caleb sat up. He looked at Storm, at the bandage on the dog's shoulder, soaked through now, stained with seawater, but still holding, at the brown eyes that hadn't looked away once. Good boy. Storm's ear twitched, the left one. Good boy. The aftermath moved in the compressed, efficient rhythm of institutional response. The cutter's crew secured the cove within 20 minutes. Pelletier and the two smugglers were taken aboard. Pelletier silent, jaw set, staring at nothing. The others shivering under mylar blankets, not meeting anyone's eyes. The cargo was photographed, inventoried, sealed. 23 boxes of diverted prescription medications, with an estimated street value that the investigating agent calculated at his clipboard and then looked up from with an expression that suggested the number had surprised even him. A boarding team searched the second vessel before it sank completely, recovering manifests and shipping labels that matched Claire's missing prescription records with the precision of a lock meeting its key. By dawn, a second vessel had arrived from Sector, carrying investigators, a forensic technician, and a Coast Guard investigative service agent named Hollis, who asked Caleb questions with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who already had most of the answers and was checking Caleb's version against the ones she'd assembled from Hank Brewer's delivery, which had reached Sector Rockland at 4:17 a.m. You transmitted a mayday on a frequency you knew was being monitored by the smuggling operation. I transmitted a mayday on channel 16, which is the international distress frequency. Using equipment that didn't belong to you. Using equipment that was illegally installed in a federally listed historic structure I'd been contracted to maintain. He paused. I maintained it. Hollis looked at him for a long moment. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the acknowledgement of someone who recognized a fellow professional. She made a note on her pad and moved on. Gerald Whitmore was arrested at his home in Augusta at 6:47 a.m. The agents who executed the warrant reported that he'd been awake when they arrived, sitting at his kitchen table, dressed in a pressed shirt and clean trousers, as if he'd been expecting them, or as if he simply hadn't slept. A photograph of Margaret sat on the table beside a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His only statement before counsel arrived was recorded in the arrest report. I saved those lighthouses. 31 years. I saved every one of them. The agents reported that he said it quietly, without anger, with the particular grief of a man who had done something he believed in and something he was ashamed of and couldn't separate the two, and had finally stopped trying. The morning ferry ran on schedule. The phone signal returned. The island exhaled. Caleb woke to sunlight, not the gray, filtered light that had greeted every other morning on Harrow Island, but actual sunlight, clear, gold, slanting through the cottage window and falling across the floor in a rectangle so bright it looked painted there. The fog had lifted overnight, and beyond the glass, the ocean lay flat and blue and quiet. Storm was asleep on the floor beside the cot, not at the door, not at the window, not guarding, sleeping. His body curled loosely, his wounded shoulder facing up, the bandage clean. Claire had replaced it at 3 a.m., working by lamplight while Caleb sat wrapped in a blanket and said nothing, because nothing was what he had left, and it was, for once, the right amount. He lay still for a moment, listened. Wind through the spruce trees outside, the distant clang of a buoy in the channel. Storm's breathing, his own. Then he got up. He fed Storm first. Kibble in the stainless bowl, fresh water from the tap. The dog ate slowly, methodically, his eyes lifting to Caleb between bites. Dogs don't carry the past. They carry people. That was enough. Caleb made coffee on the camp burner. Claire's coffee, the bag she'd left on the counter. He drank it standing at the window, looking at the lighthouse. Harrow light stood white against the blue sky, its lantern room dark, its basement, finally, truly empty. The investigators had removed the radio equipment, the generator, the cables. What remained was what had always been there: stone and iron and glass, and the memory of a light that had once guided people home. He set down the mug, found a screwdriver in the toolbox under the kitchen sink. The front door's top hinge had been loose since he'd arrived, a small squeak every time the wind pushed, a detail that had bothered him for 10 days and that he'd never found the time or the reason to fix. He fixed it now. The screwdriver turned, the hinge tightened, the door closed and closed again, silent. Storm watched from beside the wood stove, chin on paws, his expression carrying the particular patience of a dog who understands that humans sometimes need to repair small things before they can face large ones. A knock, 2 raps. The rhythm Caleb knew. He opened the door. Claire stood on the step, a paper cup of coffee from Helen Rigby's store in one hand, a roll of fresh bandage in the other. She wore the blue fleece. Her hair was down. There were dark circles under her eyes that matched his own. "Morning." "Morning." She held up the bandage. "For your shoulder. The scrape from the rocks." He'd forgotten about it. The adrenaline had carried everything for 12 hours, and now that it had set him down, his body was a catalog of complaints he hadn't filed yet. "Come in." She changed the bandage on his right shoulder. Her hands were careful, professional, warm. She worked without speaking, and he sat without speaking. And Storm lay between them on the floor, equidistant, monitoring. When she finished, she didn't stand up. She stayed close. Her hands rested on his shoulder, palm flat against the bandage, and neither of them moved. Storm lifted his head, looked at Claire, then at Caleb. Then he stood, walked to Claire, and placed his chin on her knee. Settled. Chose. Claire's hand found the dog's ear, scratched behind it. Storm's eyes half closed. "How long are you staying?" Caleb looked at her, at Storm, at the cottage with its fixed hinge and its warm stove, and its window full of ocean. At the lighthouse beyond, emptied of its secret, standing in the sunlight for the first time in weeks, without looking like it was hiding something. "I'm staying, not until they tell me to leave. Not, I don't know. Just the fact, offered without decoration, clearly, simply, as though the statement were load-bearing and nothing extraneous should be attached to it." Claire nodded. She didn't smile. She did something better. She believed him. "Good." She stood. "I'll bring dinner tonight. Helen Rigby has cod. fresh. I'll fix the porch step. It's loose. It's been loose for 2 years. Then it's time. Claire left. Her footsteps on the gravel path faded into the morning, into the sound of the island waking up to a day that didn't carry a secret in its basement. Caleb walked to the doorway, stood there. The air was cold and clean and full of salt, and the ocean stretched out in front of him. And for the first time since he could remember, looking at the water didn't make him count to 5. Storm came to stand beside him, not pressed against his leg, just beside, close, parallel. 2 bodies occupying the same space, facing the same direction, breathing at the same tempo. The dog's wounded shoulder was toward Caleb. The man's wounded shoulder was toward the dog. A symmetry that neither of them had arranged, and neither of them would rearrange. Through the trees, the chapel steeple caught the morning light. Caleb looked at it, remembered the silence inside, remembered that it had been enough. He looked down at Storm. The dog looked up. Breakfast. Storm's tail swept once across the threshold. Caleb turned back inside. The door closed behind them without a sound, just the soft click of a latch that fit, on a hinge that held, in a place that someone had decided to keep.